Okay, here's a thought experiment for you. What if there was this declassified government report, not just any report, but one written by a top-tier university statistician? And what if this report concluded pretty definitively that, quote, psychic functioning has been well established, and get this, that it was actually useful for intelligence work? Just imagine the implications, right? If these really skeptical, data-first institutions were, quietly looking into stuff that seems impossible, not with hype, but with actual rigorous science. Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we take your sources, articles, research, our own notes, the whole stack, and we really dig in. We don't just skim, we plunge deep to find the most important bits, the key takeaways, to help you get informed quickly with some surprising facts along the way, and maybe a little humor. Today, we are diving into something pretty extraordinary. A declassified document related to the CIA titled An Assessment of the Evidence for Psychic Functioning. It was written by Professor Jessica Utts from UC Davis, University of California, Davis, and it was approved for release back in 2000. So our mission today, to really explore this report, pull out the main findings, understand the methods they use, which are surprisingly solid, and kind of grapple with the conclusions, which are, well, unexpected. And we're sticking strictly to the evidence in this source. This isn't about belief systems or sensationalism. It's about data, decades of government-funded research data that really challenges how we think about perception, information, reality itself. Maybe it's an invitation for you to think about what this all means.
Okay, let's unpack this thing. We've got this report, an assessment of the evidence for psychic functioning. And like I said, this isn't some, fringe thing. It was commissioned by the U.S. government.
Specifically, it looks at research sponsored by SRI, Stanford Research Institute. Yeah, the place known for computers and defense stuff, and later SAIC, Science Applications International Corporation, another big government contractor.
Yeah.
And the author, Professor Jessica Utts, a well-respected statistician from UC Davis. So just that context alone tells you this is meant to be a serious look at the stats, not just speculation.
That context is absolutely fundamental. You really have to understand why they were doing this. The main goal was, well, pretty practical. It was driven by strategy, during the Cold War mainly. It was set up to look at evidence gathered over like 2 decades. And they wanted to know 2 main things. First, had psychic functioning actually been scientifically established using real data? And second, if it had been established, was it actually useful for the government, for intelligence gathering? That was key. There was a secondary goal, too, maybe more academic, which was to see if the research could help figure out how these abilities might work, not just if they exist. So the framework is critical. It wasn't about proving a belief for the public or anything. It was about evaluating empirical data collected under pretty strict conditions for a potential strategic edge.
And right off the bat, the abstract, it just drops this bombshell, especially if you're expecting the usual government dismissal of, weird stuff. It says, and I'm quoting directly, using the standards applied to any other area of science, it is concluded that psychic functioning has been well established. I mean, wow, that's a seriously bold claim for a declassified government paper, isn't it? It flies in the face of a lot of common assumptions.
It is a bombshell, no question. And it sets a really high bar for everything else in the report. It signals that what's coming isn't just guesswork. For a statistician, someone whose whole world is probability and evidence, to reach that kind of conclusion, well, it implies tremendous confidence in the data itself and in the methods used. It basically says, look, statistically speaking, within this research program, the existence of these phenomena isn't really debatable anymore. It's established.
Okay, before we get into the evidence itself, how they gathered it, analyzed it, let's just clarify the terms. What exactly are we talking about with psychic functioning here? The report mentions terms we all kind of know, like ESP, extrasensory perception, and psychokinesis. How does it define those scientifically?
All right, it tries to be precise, to operationalize the study. ESP, extrasensory perception, it defines as getting information through, quote, unknown means. So not through your normal 5 senses. Psychokinesis, that's defined as anomalous perturbation, basically influencing physical stuff, systems, or objects without any known physical contact or force. But interestingly, for the actual government programs it's discussing, the report shifts to more neutral terms. Less loaded, you could say. They use anomalous cognition, or AC, for the information side, and anomalous perturbation, AP, for the physical influence side. And the report, well, it focuses almost entirely on anomalous cognition, the AC part. And AC, anomalous cognition, is broken down further, which is helpful for research. It's not just one vague psychic sense. First, there's telepathy, defined as getting info directly from someone else's mind to mind. Then clairvoyance. That's getting information about a remote object or event, something you can't see or sense normally, like a hidden thing or a place far away. And then precognition. This one's maybe the weirdest. perceiving info about a future event that you couldn't possibly figure out from what you know now. So all these fall under anomalous cognition, different ways of knowing anomalously, and the report looks at evidence for them.
And the main experimental method they talk about, the one that seems to generate a lot of this data, is remote viewing, RV. How does that actually work in a lab setting? Sounds like spy fiction, not university research.
Well, the way it's described in the report, it's actually a very structured AC technique. Basically, someone, the viewer, tries to describe or sketch a remote target. That target could be a place, a photo, an object, even a video clip. But the setup is key for the science part. The viewer is totally isolated from the target. They're rigorously blinded, meaning zero sensory information, no normal clues about the target. They might just get a random number, like coordinates. And critically, no feedback during the session. They don't find out if they're right or wrong until it's completely over. Then, afterwards, an independent judge who is also blind to which target was the real one for that session looks at the viewer's description. The judge usually compares it to the actual target and maybe some decoys, other potential targets, and ranks how well it matches. The report mentions two main types: free response, where the viewer just says whatever comes to mind, and forced choice, where they might pick, say, 1 photo out of 5 that feels right. This whole strict setup is designed to completely eliminate sensory leakage, subtle cues, experimenter bias, all the normal explanations. So if you still get results, it's genuinely anomalous.
Okay, and here's where it gets, I think, for a lot of people listening, just really shocking. The abstract doesn't just hint at something. It says the statistical results are far beyond what is expected by chance, and that criticisms about bad methods, quote, are soundly refuted. And then it uses this term, prima facie evidence. That sounds almost legal. What does that mean here, scientifically? It feels like a really strong statement.
It is an incredibly strong statement, especially from a statistician. Prima facie evidence, yeah, it's often used in law, but here in a scientific context, drawing from the dictionary definition, it means evidence that is so probable, so compelling just on its face, that it has to be considered true, unless someone can definitively prove it wrong. It's like the burden of proof shifts. The report is basically saying the accumulated stats for psychic functioning meet that high standard. It repeats, the statistical results are far beyond what is expected by chance. And that the old arguments about, sloppy experiments or fraud, they've been soundly refuted by the later, much more rigorous work. It's a powerful claim from a statistical viewpoint. It's saying, okay, we're past arguing about anecdotes, the data is robust and demands attention, and the report gives an example of what counts as prima facie evidence from the government research. There was this instance where a remote viewer with absolutely no normal way of knowing described really specific technical details, like the exact angle of a microwave generator and how its beam spread out. Not just I see a building, but specific verifiable engineering data. That kind of granular detail, when there's no conventional explanation for how the viewer got it, is the kind of thing that led Professor Utz to make such a strong statement in the abstract. It suggests real information was acquired.
So the report is really clear. It's not about whether you personally believe in this stuff or if it fits what we think we know. It's purely about what the statistical evidence shows when you run these experiments under really strict, controlled conditions. It's trying to be totally objective data first.
Precisely. Professor Utz makes that point repeatedly. The conclusions aren't based on belief or feelings or stories people tell. They come directly from rigorous statistical analysis of data from controlled experiments. It's a scientific assessment, pure and simple, aiming for objectivity. And the fact the government, the CIA, was involved in commissioning it and eventually declassifying it, that just underscores the pragmatic, evidence-based motivation behind it all.
Okay, so to really get the significance of this, we need to go back to the beginning of this government research. Can you kind of set the scene? How did the U.S. government even end up funding something that sounds so out there back in the early 70s? At SRI, Stanford Research Institute, no less a serious place. And who is this Dr. Edwin May figure?
Yeah, it really does sound like a spy novel plot, doesn't it? And in some ways it kind of was. The early 70s, you have to remember, peak Cold War. There were these persistent rumors, intelligence chatter, that the Soviets were pouring resources into psychic research. Psi research, they called it sometimes, potentially for spying or military stuff. So the U.S. government, basically driven by, not wanting to be left behind or miss a potential threat or advantage, felt they had to look into it. Was this stuff real? Could it be weaponized or used for intel? It wasn't just idle curiosity. It was national security, potential intelligence gaps. And Dr. Edwin May, yeah, he was a physicist. He became a really key figure, eventually the project director for this very classified program. He brought a scientific, quantitative approach to a field that was often, pretty fuzzy and anecdotal.
And the report mentioned some really intriguing early operational successes at SRI. These sound wild, like something from a secret briefing file. Can you tell us about those, the things that maybe kept the funding flowing?
Absolutely. These early cases, while maybe scientifically ambiguous later on, were powerful narratives at the time. They provided a strong, if maybe unproven, reason to keep digging. The program apparently had 3 big operational successes early on that got a lot of attention internally. First, there was this West Virginia site. Picture the Cold War paranoia. 2 remote viewers, totally isolated, blind to the target, start describing an underground secret facility. The details were apparently quite specific layout, even some equipment, and later a security agency confirmed the facility existed, matching the descriptions through normal means. You can imagine the buzz that created. Maybe this actually works. Then something similar with the communist block site. Again, 2 viewers described the site, this time deep in the Ural Mountains. And again, their descriptions were apparently corroborated later by other intelligence sources. And maybe the most famous one involved Semipalatinsk, USSR. Viewers described details including a huge, previously unknown gantry crane, which was later confirmed by satellite imagery, I believe, to be part of a very sensitive, secret Soviet site. So yeah, these were definitely compelling anecdotes for the funders. But, and this is where the report's scientific caution comes in, it's very careful to point out the problem with these early cases. While they sounded amazing and were operationally interesting, there wasn't a foolproof way back then to be 100% sure the info came only from psychic ability. Could there have been some subtle leakage? Unintentional clues? Maybe the viewers already knew something subconsciously. It was hard to definitively rule out conventional explanations. So this really highlights the early challenge. They had these exciting stories, but they needed to move towards much more controlled science to get truly rigorous, undeniable proof. It was a learning curve, figuring out how to design experiments that closed all those loopholes.
Right. So after those tantalizing but scientifically shaky early successes, how did SRI pivot? How did they move towards more controlled science that could actually stand up to scrutiny and give them real, quantifiable evidence? That seems like a critical shift.
It was an absolutely fundamental shift. They realized that for this to be taken seriously by the scientific community, or even internally for reliable use, it had to meet scientific standards. So the early scientific work at SRI, roughly 73 to 75, marks that change. They started running much more controlled experiments. They used different kinds of targets, not just secret bases, but mundane stuff too. Random materials, outdoor scenes, even a swimming pool once, just to see if the effect was general. And the report is upfront about the early criticisms. Issues like, how were subjects picked? How was the scoring done statistically? Could the judges have been biased? These were valid concerns back then. But crucially, the report emphasizes that the later experiments at SRI, and especially ones that followed at SAIC, were specifically designed to fix those exact problems. The methodology got much, much tighter over time, which Professor Utz details very carefully.
Okay, so looking at that whole SRI period from 73 to 88, after they started tightening things up, what did the big picture analysis show? What were the main takeaways from that whole first chunk of government research?
Well, there was a really major analysis in 1988, a meta-analysis led by Ed May and his team. It pulled together data from the entire SRI program up to that point. And we're not talking a small study here. It covered 154 separate experiments, over 26,000 individual trials, which added up to more than 1 million distinct remote viewings, and involved 227 different people as subjects. The statistical results from that huge data set were, well, stunning. The odds of getting results that strong just by chance, about once in every 10,000 trials. That's a p-value under 10 to the minus 4. I mean, just to give context, in many fields, p equals 0.05. A 1 in 20 chance is considered significant. This is orders of magnitude beyond that. It's incredibly unlikely to be just random luck. And some key findings came out of that whole SRI era that really started to define the phenomenon. First, they definitively confirmed the statistical significance of free response remote viewing. People could describe unknown targets better than chance. Second, they identified 6 specific individuals who consistently performed way, way beyond chance, like star viewers. This showed that some people seemed particularly gifted, or maybe just better practiced. Third, they did mass screenings and found that maybe around 40% of volunteers showed some remote viewing ability. That's surprisingly high. It suggests maybe it's not some super rare superpower, but a potential that's more widely distributed than people thought. But here's where it gets really, really weird and challenges basic physics. They found that performance did not depend on the physical distance between the viewer and the target. It didn't matter if the target was next door or on the other side of the planet. The results were statistically the same, and equally baffling. Electromagnetic shielding didn't block it. They put viewers in shielded rooms, Faraday cages basically, and it made no difference. This implies it's not using any known part of the electromagnetic spectrum. And maybe the most mind-bending, they found compelling evidence for precognition, cases where the target was randomly selected after the viewer had already finished describing it. Think about that. Describing something that hasn't even been chosen yet.
That really does just stop you in your tracks, doesn't it? If this ability, whatever it is, ignores distance, ignores physical barriers like EM shielding, what does that even mean about information? About consciousness? About how reality is structured? It seems to break all the rules we thought we knew about physics, where things are local and signals have speed limits. This data just throws a wrench in all that.
It absolutely does. It points towards some kind of information transfer that just doesn't fit our standard models of physics. It suggests something non-local is going on. When physicists talk about non-locality, they mean effects that seem instantaneous across distance, no signal traveling between points, like in quantum entanglement. This data hints at something similar for consciousness or information access. It raises huge questions. Is consciousness somehow interconnected in ways we don't understand? Is there some deeper layer to reality? Think about how quantum mechanics totally upended classical physics. This kind of data, if true, could be just as revolutionary. It's a stark contrast to the neat, predictable universe we usually think about. It's profound, and researchers are still grappling with what it could mean. And the report also makes a point of looking at consistency between different labs. That's crucial in science, right? To make sure it's not just one team getting weird results. For instance, SRI's remote viewing findings showed, quote, good conceptual similarity and statistical consistency with results from Ganzfeld experiments. That's a related technique studied in many different labs around the world. So seeing that kind of cross-lab agreement, even early on, really strengthens the case that this is a real phenomenon and not just some fluke or artifact of SRI's specific methods.
Okay, so after SRI laid that groundwork, showing these statistically significant, frankly bizarre results, the government funding shifted. The research moved to SAEC, Science Applications International Corporation, another big contractor. How is this phase different? Was it just a new building? Or did the science itself change, the approach, or the goals?
Oh, it was definitely more than just a change of scenery. It marked a real evolution in the scientific strategy, kind of reflecting that the program was maturing. The team at SASC was deliberately put together to be interdisciplinary. They brought in experts from physics, neuroscience, psychology, all still under the direction of Dr. Ed May. And this reflected a clear shift. They were moving beyond just trying to prove these phenomena exist. SRI had pretty much done that, statistically speaking. The focus now was much more on understanding the mechanisms, the how. How does it work? What affects it? Can it be applied? It was about deeper scientific investigation into the nature of anomalous cognition itself, not just proving it was possible. They wanted to figure out its characteristics, its limits, maybe even if it could be trained.
And the report talks about the 10 experiments done at SAIC. What kinds of things were they looking into? Was it all just more remote viewing, or did they branch out?
They were quite diverse, those 10 experiments. It really shows that shift toward understanding the how. 6 were still focused on remote viewing, refining methods, gathering more data under even tighter controls. But the other 4 looked into different aspects of anomalous cognition, really broadening the investigation. The report has tables and SAIC experiments listed by Dr. Edwin May, which summarizes them. And generally, the remote viewing experiments continue to show positive effect sizes, confirming the earlier findings. But the types of experiments show the new direction. For example, they had AC with binary coding. Could you use this to send simple messages like influencing binary choices, zeros or ones, a sort of psychic Morse code attempt, AC in lucid dreams? Really interesting trying remote viewing while people were in a lucid dreaming state, tapping into altered states, ERD-AC behavior. This used EEG, measuring brain waves during remote viewing, trying to find physiological markers. Were there specific brain patterns linked to success, getting into the neuroscience, and even one called Entropy 2. This looked at whether RV performance was related to the target's complexity, that they called change in visual entropy, or cognitively differentiable elements. Basically, does a more complex, information-rich target work better? Like comparing a blank wall to a busy street scene. The idea was maybe the psychic sense latches onto novelty or information density, similar to how our eyes scan for changes. They were probing its operating principles.
That's incredibly detailed. And looking at brainwaves, target complexity, that's way beyond just asking, can someone guess this picture? How did they analyze the remote viewing data specifically? Did they just look at overall averages, or did they dig deeper?
Well, they definitely dug deeper. SAIC used a really granular approach. They assessed results by what they called homogeneous sets. That means breaking the data down, looking at individual viewers separately, or looking at results for specific types of targets. This gives you a much more nuanced picture than just one big average. For instance, Table 2, individual effect sizes, focuses just on the expert remote viewers. The stars identified by numbers like 009, 1 through 1372, and so on. And it showed that for some of these key people, like viewers 009 and 372, the effect size for static targets was really strong, around 0.385. This confirmed that certain individuals could perform consistently well, replicating the SRI findings about star performers. But a really critical finding came from comparing static versus dynamic targets. Static targets like photos, fixed locations consistently produced positive results. The effect size was 0.124 with a p-value of 0.04. Statistically significant. Viewers could get information about unchanging things. However, dynamic targets like video clips, things with motion, did not show statistically significant evidence of psychic functioning. The p-value was 0.50, basically pure chance. And that's a really specific, important clue about how this works. It suggests the nature of the target matters. Maybe rapidly changing visual information is harder to lock onto anomalously than something static. It hints at limitations or optimal conditions for AC.
That is a crucial difference, isn't it? It suggests it's not just a magic window onto anything, anytime. The psychic sense might have preferences or limitations. And speaking of rigor, the report really hammers home how tight the SAIC methodology was. What specific controls did they put in place, especially given how controversial this all is? They must have gone to incredible lengths to ensure the results were clean.
They absolutely did. You could argue it set a kind of gold standard for parapsychology research back then. SAIK implemented protocols specifically designed to shut down all the previous criticisms from skeptics from internal reviews. They wanted to make absolutely sure the results weren't due to sloppy work or fraud or even just subtle accidental clues. It was an all-out effort to isolate the phenomenon. So, some key safeguards. Strict blinding. This was non-negotiable. Viewers knew absolutely nothing about the target, nothing about how their session went afterwards, not even who the judge was. Total isolation. Maybe just given a random number. No contact between experimenters and viewers or judges during the crucial parts. Zero chance for unintentional cues. Independent judging. The judges scoring the sessions were also totally blind. They'd get the viewer's description and a packet of potential targets, the real one, plus decoys, and they had to rank the match without knowing which was which. Eliminate subjective scoring bias. Randomization. Targets and decoys were chosen using proper tested random methods. No bias in what got picked. Material control. They even used duplicate photo sets. Make sure there were no fingerprints, no smudges, nothing that could subtly give the game away. Meticulous attention to detail. Predefined stopping rules. This is huge in stats. They decided before starting exactly when they would stop the experiment and analyze the data. Prevent stopping just because you happen to get good results. A big no-no called data snooping. Pre-planned analysis. Similarly, they decided exactly which statistical tests they would use before collecting any data. No cherry-picking analyses after the fact to find something significant. That avoids another common problem called p-hacking.
Wow, that level of control is just really impressive, especially for this field. They were clearly bending over backwards to anticipate and neutralize any possible conventional explanation or criticism, trying to make the results scientifically bulletproof.
Exactly. And the report stresses these weren't just for show. They were essential to ensure that any positive results really were due to anomalous cognition, not just experimental artifacts or wishful thinking. The fact that the positive results kept showing up under these incredibly strict conditions is what Professor Utz points to as being so compelling.
Okay, so with all that rigor, the report asks, was anything learned at SAIE? Beyond just more proof, what insights do they get into how this psychic functioning might actually operate? What were its characteristics? This feels like where the science gets really interesting.
Yeah, this is where it shifts from if to how. The experiment started testing specific ideas about the mechanisms. What are the rules of AC? What makes it work better or worse? For instance, target selection. Like we mentioned, experiments 1 and 10 looked at that visual entropy idea, and they found a correlation. Targets with more complex, detailed, or novel visual information, higher entropy, tended to get better results. This suggests the psychic sense might work a bit like our normal senses, being drawn to or performing better with richer information, rather than just picking up anything equally well. It implies it's selective. Remote staring. Experiment 7 was pretty wild. People in the US and the former Soviet Union trying to affect each other's physiology just by staring remotely. No contact. They measured galvanic skin response, basically, subtle sweating indicating arousal. And the results suggested the effect was stronger when the starer and the person being stared at were of opposite sexes. That hints at some kind of nuanced, maybe interpersonal dynamic, not just a simple physical force. It suggests the interaction might be more complex than just mind over matter. Enhanced binary computer guessing. Experiment 2, even though they called it extremely inefficient practically, was conceptually fascinating. Huh. They had a computer trying to guess binary choices 0 or 1, and it seemed to guess right 76% of the time, way above the 50% chance baseline. This hinted that AC might not just be about getting information, but maybe also about subtly influencing physical systems or random processes, extending into anomalous perturbation. Not just knowing, but influencing, even slightly.
Those details are just, yeah, fascinating. It paints a picture of AC not as some vague superpower, but it's something with specific operating rules, things that affect it, maybe even different flavors of it. It's not magic. It seems to have parameters. That's where the real science starts to emerge. Okay, so we have the SRI work, then the even more rigorous SAIC work. But in science, 1 or 2 labs aren't enough, right? You need independent confirmation. Did other labs manage to validate these findings? The report keeps mentioning Ganzfeld experiments. What exactly are those, and how do they connect to remote viewing? Is this like a separate research stream confirming the results?
Yeah, independent replication is absolutely the cornerstone of scientific acceptance. And the report makes a strong case that this happened. Remote viewing and Ganzfeld experiments are related. They share similar techniques and theoretical underpinnings, making them sort of parallel lines of evidence. In a typical Ganzfeld setup, you try to create a state of mild sensory deprivation for the receiver. They'll be reclining, maybe red light over the eyes using ping pong ball halves, white noise, and headphones. The idea is to quiet the normal senses, to let potentially weaker anomalous signals come through. While the receiver is in this state, a sender somewhere else focuses on a target, often a picture or video. The receiver then describes their impressions or later tries to pick the correct target from a set of decoys. And the report highlights that Ganzfeld results across many studies and many labs consistently show a success rate significantly above chance, typically around 25% correct when chance is 20% in a 4 or 5 choice task. That persistent 5% difference, replicated repeatedly, is statistically significant and points towards the same kind of anomalous cognition seen in RV.
So let's talk numbers then. The report actually summarizes results from several independent labs, beyond just SRI and SAIC. What does that data show? Does it back up the consistency claim?
It really does. The report pulls together data from 4 independent labs plus SRI and SAIC. Table 3, remote viewing and Ganzfeld replications, lays it out quite clearly, and the consistency is striking. Let's look at some of those figures. SRI, as we said, 770 sessions, effect size 0.209, solid baseline, SAIC. The next phase, 455 sessions, effect size slightly higher at 0.230, consistent, maybe even stronger with better methods than the independent labs. Psychophysical Research Laboratories, PRL, in Princeton. 329 sessions, 32% hit rate, effect size 0.167, still well above chance. University of Amsterdam, the Netherlands. An academic lab, 124 sessions, impressive 37% hit rate, strong effect size 0.261. University of Edinburgh, Scotland, another university, 97 sessions, 33% hit rate, effect size 0.177. Institute for Parapsychology, North Carolina. 100 sections, also 33% hit rate, effect size 0.177.
Okay, wow. What jumps out there is just the consistency. You've got labs in different countries, US, Netherlands, Scotland, different researchers, presumably slightly different setups, all getting statistically significant results pointing in the same direction. That's pretty powerful, isn't it? It argues against it being just one group's pet finding.
It absolutely is powerful, and that's precisely the point the report drives home. It synthesizes all this and concludes very directly that remote viewing has been conceptually replicated across a number of laboratories by various experimenters and in different cultures, and it calls it a robust effect. And then, tackling the usual criticism head-on, it states it's unlikely that methodological problems could account for the remarkable consistency of results shown. This is Utz basically saying, look, the argument that this is all just bad experiments in one place doesn't hold water anymore. Multiple independent teams using rigorous methods are finding the same thing. The phenomenon appears to be real and repeatable.
That really does strengthen the core argument significantly. It moves it from interesting results from a secret project to a potentially real phenomenon observed repeatedly under scientific conditions. It suggests something genuine is underlying all this, something that, as Professor Utz argues, warrants a serious scientific look, maybe even a rethink of some basic assumptions. Okay, so the report builds this strong case, statistically, for the existence of anomalous cognition. But then the final sections kind of shift gears, right? They move from the pure science question of if it exists to something much more practical. Is it useful? Which, let's face it, was probably the main reason the government was paying for all this in the first place. That's a whole different ballgame, moving from lab results to real-world application.
Exactly. It's a crucial pivot, back to the original pragmatic driver. The report concludes AC is possible, statistically proven within the research. But then it has to grapple with usefulness, especially for something like intelligence gathering. And it acknowledges that figuring out the usefulness requires, well, more speculation, more work. Because how do you reliably take a subtle effect, remember, small and medium effect sizes, which often gives you fragmented or symbolic information, and turn that into timely, actionable intelligence you can bet lives or policy on? That's the gap. Bridging controlled lab results with messy, high-stakes reality. The phenomenon might be real, but is it dependable enough to be truly useful operationally? That's the million-dollar question.
Given its origins, the report must suggest some potential applications for intelligence, right? How did they envision it being used, and what value could it possibly add?
It does sketch out some possibilities, assuming reliability could be improved or understood better. It suggests that maybe end users, intelligence analysts, operatives, could potentially be trained to use RV themselves as another tool in their toolkit. It also argues that even if the information is weird, fragmented, unfamiliar territory, it can still be valuable. Maybe it provides the first clue, directs conventional assets to the right place, helps corroborate other data, or offers insights when all other doors are closed. Any extra data point can help build the bigger picture. And it mentions that Viewer 372 at SAI, one of the stars, seemed particularly good at describing technical sites. This hints that maybe specific people could be trained or selected for specific types of intelligence targets, like finding missile silos versus, say, tracking individuals. Specialization. And there's another really interesting point the report makes about the people involved, about who actually has this ability. It notes that while the Gansfeld studies often use specially selected subjects, suggesting maybe it's a rare talent, the remote viewing research found something different. It seemed the ability might be easier to find in those individuals who devote themselves to the tasks. Now, that challenges the whole idea of it being some innate magical gift only a few are born with. It suggests it might be more like a skill, something that maybe many people have a latent potential for, and it can be developed or strengthened through practice, dedication, the right training.
That is a surprising idea, isn't it? That it's not necessarily about finding rare psychics, but maybe about training people, like learning an instrument or a language. It kind of democratizes the whole concept. It takes it out of the realm of magic and into the realm of potential human capability, something that could theoretically be cultivated. That opens up a whole different perspective. All right, so we followed this journey, decades of secret government research, SRI, SAIC, increasingly tight methods, independent replication. After all that, what's the final word? What is Professor Eck's ultimate conclusion in this report?
The bottom line on anomalous cognition.
The bottom line is stated incredibly clearly, and it's unambiguous. The report concludes, anomalous cognition is possible and has been demonstrated. Full stop. It's not wishy-washy, it's direct. And it immediately follows up by stressing this isn't based on belief, but rather on commonly accepted scientific criteria. It points back to the stats, the methods, the rigor we've been talking about. It summarizes that the phenomenon has been replicated in different labs, different cultures, and that the later experiments were well designed enough to rule out flaws or fraud as the main explanation. So Professor Utz's final verdict, based on her assessment of the evidence presented, is that AC, especially remote viewing, meets the standards of scientific proof. But it goes beyond just saying it exists. The report also offers some really critical insights into the nature of the phenomenon itself, things that are arguably even more profound. First, it suggests that sender's people focusing on the target to send it to the viewer might not actually be necessary for successful remote viewing. This implies the information isn't necessarily going mind to mind. Maybe the viewer is accessing the information directly from, well, somewhere else, the target itself or some information field. It shifts the theoretical model away from simple telepathy. Second, and this is the really big one, it concludes that distance and time and space do not seem to be an impediment. That finding, showing up consistently, is just revolutionary. It fundamentally challenges our basic understanding of reality, causality, space-time. If you can get info about something, regardless of how far away it is, or even if it hasn't happened yet, it implies reality might be non-local, interconnected in ways our current physics doesn't fully grasp. It potentially opens the door to a completely different view of the universe. And third, a point of nuance. While the effects are statistically undeniable, they are consistently small to medium effect sizes. This is important. It means the results are real, they are repeatable, but the effect isn't usually huge or overwhelming. It's subtle. It's often partial information, maybe symbolic. This helps explain why it might be hard to use reliably for practical everyday things, but it doesn't make it any less real scientifically.
So, given that conclusion that it's real, replicated, but maybe subtle and weird, what's the big recommendation the report makes for future research? It sounds like it completely shifts the goalposts.
It absolutely does. The recommendation is probably the most provocative part of the whole report.
Professor Utz states, quite bluntly, that it would be wasteful to keep doing experiments just trying to look for proof of psychic functioning. She argues the proof phase is done. Instead, she strongly recommends that resources, time, scientific effort, funding, it should all be redirected towards understanding how this ability works. Figure out the underlying mechanisms, explore the practical implications, develop ways to apply it, maybe even enhance it, shift the focus entirely from if to how. And this, of course, raises that huge lingering question for all of us listening. If a detailed government-commissioned assessment by a top statistician based on decades of research concluded this stuff is demonstrated and said we should figure out how it works, why is it still so often ignored, dismissed, or treated like pseudoscience in mainstream discussion? That gap between this documented, declassified evidence and broader scientific or public acceptance, that's maybe one of the most fascinating puzzles highlighted by this whole deep dive.
So let's leave you with this thought. Just consider this. A declassified government report from a serious statistician concludes psychic functioning is demonstrated. And it says the next step isn't proving it anymore, but figuring out how it works. What does that imply about information, about consciousness, about the limits we thought existed on human perception? If these abilities are real, and if they genuinely don't care about distance or time, what new possibilities does that open up? What new questions does it force us to ask about the universe, about our own minds, and maybe our connection to everything else? It really pushes us to rethink the very fabric of reality as we understand it.